or good morning, depending on where you. We are very, very happy of presenting today our workshop of March that will be in charge of Professor Ian O'Donnell from the University College Dublin. Ian will present today on Prison Life, Pain, Resistance and Purpose, his last book. So we are really, really happy to have him with us. Thank you, Ian, for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks a million, Maximo. I'm delighted to be here. You're there, I'm here, but we're all together. I have some slides to show you, and what I'd like to do for the great. So for the 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes that I've got, I'd like to say a little bit about my recent book, Prison Life, which is an exercise in comparative penology. And what I'm going to do is give 4 snapshots of the social life of prisons. One is from a prison in Europe, one is from a prison in Africa, and there are 2 US institutions. One is a federal penitentiary and the other is a state prison. And I'll say a little bit about why I focused on those 4 particular places. And then I have a brief comment to make on 3 of the book's aims, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And before I get started, I just wanted to give a brief intellectual history of the project and say a little bit about the gestation of the book, because it was unusual, I suppose. And it began with a curious priest, curious in the inquisitive kind of a way rather than in a strange way. And it continued then with some field trips to Ethiopia, and then looped back to a distant memory of an institution that was demolished some time ago. And then after quite a bit of reading and reflection and cogitation resulted in the book that I'm here to talk to you about today, that was published last year by NYU Press. So where did it all start, and what was the role of this inquisitive priest that I mentioned? I'd written a book about how prisoners deal with the passage of time, particularly when they're on their own, called Prisoner's Solitude and Time. And my university used that book to promote its graduate programs. So they did posters on buses and trains, and the posters had my smiling face and a contact number. And if you want to find out more about graduate study in University College Dublin, why don't you give us a buzz? And a missionary priest who'd been working in Ethiopia for 10 or 15 years got off the plane in Dublin Airport from Addis Ababa and got onto the bus and sat down and looked at one of these posters and thought, well, I'll get in touch with Ian O'Donnell and see if he might come out and spend a bit of time in a prison that this man, Paddy Moran is his name, had been working in for 10 or 11 years. And the commander of the prison was very open to innovation. And Paddy thought, well, if I came out and I could spend some time there and I had some suggestions to make that might possibly improve the lives of the men, women and children who were held there, and the financial implications weren't too great, then the commander of the prison would be open to doing what he could. So I accepted Paddy's invitation to go out. This is in 2016, and the prison is in the southern nations, nationalities and peoples region. Ethiopia is a huge country. It's a beautiful country, war-torn for the last little while, unfortunately. So I went out there with him in 2016 and back again in 2017 and 2018, and I'm going back out for the final time in August of this year. And I was really struck by the extreme sociability of prison life and the porous nature of the institution and the hands-off nature of the relationship with staff. So there was 1 member of staff for every 70 prisoners. In Ireland, the ratio was pretty much 1-to-1. And despite the crowding and the poor material conditions, I was really struck by how safe the prison was for the people who were spending their time there. And the contrast with the supermax institutions that I'd studied for Prisoner's Solitude and Time, the previous book that Father Moran had seen on the bus, it couldn't have been greater. And that got me thinking about integration, which was very high in the Ethiopian prison and very low in the supermax, and regulation, which was very high in the supermax and very low in the Ethiopian prison. And I'll come back to the terms in a few minutes and say how I define them for the purposes of this book. I started thinking about these dimensions of prison life, integration and regulation. I went back to Ethiopia a couple more times, and I started to think about the kinds of institutions that might be located at other points along these two scales. And that brought me back to a memory of a visit that I made in 1999. I worked in Oxford University for a number of years, and I came back to Dublin. I was director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust for a few years. And in that capacity, I was part of a delegation to, even the name of the institution is contested, Long Kesh, Her Majesty's Prison Maze. I call it the H blocks in the book because it describes the shape of the, describes the prison architecture. And the visit to the institution was in the context of a maturing peace process. It was well underway by the late 1990s, and the institution was to close the following year. And I was really struck that the prisoners' organizational structure in what was at the time the most secure prison in Europe was so deeply embedded that when we went there, we met not with the staff, but with the prisoners' leaders. And at the end of our meeting, the commanding officer of the wing that we were on gave us all a postcard to take away as a kind of a memento of our visit. And that was a place where regulation was extremely high, but so too was integration. I kept the postcard as it happens. I used it as a bookmark in a book of collected prisoners' writings, and I reproduced it in this book. So throw nothing away. There's only 24 years sitting on a shelf, and I managed to get some use out of it. And when I turned my attention back to the Supermax, I decided to focus on the apotheosis of the Supermax is the ADX, the Administrative Maximum Institution in Florence, Colorado. It's an impossible place to visit. I asked, could I visit? Nobody's been allowed in there for decades. The UN rapporteur on torture has asked me to visit and so on. They won't let anybody in. It's a pretty dark side. But there's quite a bit of litigation. There are some excellent first-person accounts. There are some reports from audits. There's the audit inspection. There are some policy documents and so on. There's some really good investigative journalism. I'm going to mention a little bit of that later on too. So it was possible to get some sense of how the place worked. And that left me with one institution, a place where regulation and integration were low. And I remembered reading about the building tenders when I was doing the Masters in Criminology in the 1980s in Texas. So I read what I could find about the building tenders, and I contacted some of the people who'd done some of the research there in the 70s and the 80s when that situation was under review. And I went to Texas, and I spent a bit of time in the archives of the Texas Prison Museum. And I went to the Eastern Unit, which was a very interesting place where the litigation that brought down the building tender system originated. So I spent a few days there. And I decided to limit my attention to the 4 case study institutions. And in each of the institutions to focus on a particular decade that was significant. And to look at the prison through the perspective of one prisoner who was molded by the institution, but did something to mold it in return. And I'll have something to say about each of those as I kind of move through the institutions over the next half an hour or so. So I said I wanted to start by giving a kind of an intellectual history of the project, and I suppose it could be summarized as serendipity. If Paddy Moran hadn't got onto the bus and looked at the poster and invited me out, would it have got moving? Underpinned by a commitment to the importance of comparativism. And it was a curiosity-driven project, so it wasn't, there's no external funding for it, apart from some support from my own institution in terms of making a visitor to Ethiopia. And it was carried out according to a time frame that I deemed suitable to the task rather than to the dictates of some kind of external funding body. Before I go through the 4 case study institutions, what do I mean by integration and regulation, these 2 dimensions that I think are helpful in terms of getting a handle on the social life of a prison? Integration, as I define it in the book, refers to cohesion and solidarity, shared norms, the degree of identification with and attachment to a recognizable and enduring group, the density and emotional intensity of relational ties, the complexity of networks. It requires the kind of mixing which allows observable social formations to evolve. It's about embedded social bonds. Membership of a well-integrated prisoner society provides a buffer against environmental uncertainty. That's my definition from the book. What about regulation? Regulation involves the externally formulated and imposed aspects of the regime, specifically the rule book its clarity and ambition, the diligence that's enforced, and the staffing complement. These are the official demands that the prison makes of its occupants, constituting an exoskeleton for the prisoner body, a set of constraints that determines the direction and nature of travel. They're resisted to a greater or lesser extent everywhere. So that's broadly speaking what I mean by the two terms. And at one end of the spectrum, ADX Florence, the regulation is incessant, it's unyielding, the rule book is compendious, every aspect of life is controlled. At the other end, Iserbet, the institution in Ethiopia, regulation is intermittent and indifferent. Integration ranges from the deep and the united. I'm talking here about the Irish Republican prisoners in the H blocks, to the shallow and fragmented. I'm referring here to prisoners in the Eastern Unit who were split by race, language, and further by the building tenders who were appointed to enforce discipline. One thing I want to do in the book is add a bit of nuance that I think is necessary to debates about the Society of Captives, Gresham Sykes' famous term, by drawing on an example from the Global South and from the smaller jurisdictions that tend to be neglected on the basis of superficial similarities with Britain and the US. And I take issue in the book with Sykes' contention that custodial institutions share, as I summarize on the slide here, I quote from him, basic similarities which override the variations of time, place, and purpose. And I'm not suggesting that Sykes' analysis has become redundant with age. I'm saying it never had the universality sometimes attributed to it. And even when it was written in New Jersey in the 1950s, there was no reason to believe that what Sykes found in Trenton would map clearly onto what was happening in Arkansas or Texas or a southern US state, let alone what was going on in other countries. So I think, and The Society of Captives is a great book, and it's an eloquent rendering of one institution, but it's just that. It's an account of one prison in one era, in one place, that differed in very important aspects from other contemporaneous prisons. So I'm going to go through the four, give a few minutes on each of the four case study institutions, and then talk about three kind of themes from the book, and then we'll have time, for any questions. And the first is the prison in Ethiopia that I went to. And when I went there, I expected that few of the generally accepted minimum standards would apply. And of course, that was the case. And I stuck a copy of the Nelson Mandela rules onto my arm, and I went out with the measuring tape and all the rest of it. And just to give one kind of example of the conditions, the UN have a minimum standard for the amount of space per person in a dormitory. This was dormitory living exclusively. And the minimum standard space requirement is 3.4 square meters per person. And I measured the biggest dormitory in this institution, and it was 140 square meters. So to satisfy the UN standard, there should have been no more than 41 people in that dormitory. And when I visited, there were 208. So it was very, very cramped. And there's no sanitation, no integral sanitation in the dormitories. So there was a bucket in the corner there. All those mattresses were on the ground at night, and people were squeezed in pretty tight. There's some ventilation now. That's a relatively recent innovation. There were large disparities in income. It's a market society. It's a cash economy in the prison. I know in UK prisons and Irish prisons, cash isn't much good to you. This was a market economy. The Commercial Bank of Ethiopia came in twice a week. People could lodge money that they made. They could withdraw money if they needed something to spend. And some of the more entrepreneurial prisoners had far greater earning capacity than the staff. Others remained impoverished and reliant on the charity of their peers, and they were polishing shoes and doing things like that. They lived communally, and the food that was issued was the same for everybody. But there were obvious differences in terms of whether somebody could afford to go to one of the prison cafes that the prisoners ran rather than eating the prison-issued food, how often they could buy tea or coffee, the extent of their wardrobe, and so on. And what I found really fascinating about this institution was that the prisoners had a written constitution that they drew up themselves. And I give the stated purpose there from the preamble to the code. So it's 22 pages long. It's written in Amharic, obviously. I had to get it translated when I was out there. And the purpose of these regulations is to enable prisoners to learn from their crimes in order to make them peaceful and productive citizens when they depart the institution, to create a tranquil community where work is plentiful, time passes quickly, and life is well ordered. And the code was introduced by a charismatic prisoner who was elected as the prisoner's chairman. So they had their own executive committee. It was really bureaucratic. Every dormitory had a set of committees to deal with, hygiene and so on and so forth. But the prisoners had an executive team of 3, and they were elected. And this man was the chairman at the time that I went out, and I put some time into introducing this code because he wanted to eliminate profiteering by prisoner leaders, and he wanted to ensure consistency of treatment across the institution, so that if there was a breach of the code in one dormitory, that the response to it was the same as might be expected in another. And he said to me, before we had a code, the leader's strength mattered. Now there is a system, personalities matter less, it's more civilized. And the code provided clear guidance about what constituted acceptable treatment and allowed a large number of people to live in close proximity without too much friction. It covered everything from cleanliness through acceptable conduct in the dormitories to assaults and escape attempts. There was a scale of punishments that was graduated according to the seriousness of the offence and whether or not it was a repetition. I'll give an example of that now in a moment. It was designed to endure, but also to be revived. So when it was produced in draft form, the dormitories broke up into groups and discussed it. And then there were kind of plenary meetings to accept it and so on. And there was a mechanism within it to revise the rules should they be deemed redundant or need updating or what have you. So it was sophisticated and an elaborate way of building consensus in the institution. And it was enforced by prisoners who volunteered to be members of a kind of a corps of order keepers who didn't get paid for it. They put on a kind of a purple hat when they were doing this job, and they made sure that if there were any breaches, they were dealt with. And I've just given one example there, just to, you might be interested. If a prisoner assaults another prisoner, these are the sanctions that are set out in the code. So a report might be made to the staff. So the code was agreed with the prison commander. It kind of interfaced with state law and so on. They might be required to collect and dispose of the dormitory's urine for 10 to 20 days. So that's an unpleasant task, taking the buckets out and sluicing them and cleaning them and bringing them back in again. They might lose their bed space. So you could be a couple of years waiting to get a mattress on a bunk, and to lose that and go back down onto the floor, that's a significant hardship. They could forfeit the right to apply for parole or a pardon. The victim could take matters to an outside court and so on. So that's the first of the institutions that I kind of wanted to outline to you, where the level of integration was high and the level of regulation was low, and the prisoners came up with their own written charter, their own constitution for living. The second, the H blocks in Northern Ireland, were places that, and I'm looking at the IRA prisoners, and I'm looking at the 1990s. So there's a huge literature about the H blocks, the Long Kesh internment camp and the institution that replaced it. From the 70s up to the late 80s, there were no wash protests that went on for years. The prisoners wouldn't wear the uniform. They were in blankets for years. There were hunger strikes. 10 prisoners died. I'm looking at the 1990s, which was after these protest years. And I'm interested in kind of contrasting in each of the institutions the official statement of purpose and then how life was actually lived. And the official statement of the Northern Ireland Prison Service is shown on the slide there: to treat all prisoners as individuals, regardless of their religious beliefs or political opinions, and to offer them the opportunity to serve their sentence free from paramilitary influence. Now, that wasn't an opportunity that the prisoners sought or availed of at all. And the idea that the paramilitary influence was some kind of baleful external force that they might need protection from was a long way from the truth. And the Republican prisoners that are the subject of my case study, they were loyalist prisoners in other wings. I'm just looking at the provisional IRA prisoners. They strove to live according to their own principles and priorities. And key among those was a desire that they would be seen as prisoners of war who wouldn't have been incarcerated had the external circumstance and not demanded that they took up arms. So while the formal objective of the Northern Ireland Prison Service was about individualisation of treatment, the prisoner society was characterised by the creation of a charter, again, a written document, a written set of kind of principles that undergirded how they lived, and a collective existence where they published a quarterly magazine that sold 6,000 or 7,000 copies. It was incredible, in full colour, with poetry and commentary and debate and so on in it. There was the odd poetry collection. They cultivated the Irish language, and they enthusiastically pursued educational opportunities. And I said in each institution, I kind of focused on one individual who was quite instrumental in terms of influencing the nature of the regime there. So it was Chalo Gabino, the chairman of the prisoners in Ethiopia. In the H blocks of Northern Ireland, it was Lawrence McKeown, who was the architect of the charter that the Republican prisoners put together to govern their lives. He was on hunger strike too, and he was 69 days without food, and he was in a coma. His mother intervened and took him off the strike, and if she hadn't, he would have been the 11th man to die. He's a playwright and did a PhD when he was in prison called Unrepentant Fenian Bastards, the structuring of a Republican prisoner community or something along those lines. And Lawrence, who was the architect of this charter, said, rather than being casualties of war, we realized we could be agents of change. So these were men who'd been through a lot of hardship in the protest years, focused very hard on the kind of society that they wanted to create, and felt that if they could transform their lives in the institution, that there might be scope for transforming the environment outside the prison walls. They drew up reading lists, and the prisoners were, I give the reading lists in the book, and prisoners were expected to take notes on the texts and read them in a prescribed order. And the first list was fiction that addressed issues of working class culture, capitalist exploitation and imperialism. So Brendan Behan's The Borstal Boy, or Robert Tressel, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists, that kind of thing. The second list was historical and political works that put the Irish situation into a wider context. So Bobby Sands, the first hunger striker who died, Westminster MP, One Day in My Life, or the speeches and writings of Ernesto Che Guevara, that kind of material. And then the third list was a comprehensive introduction to Marxist-Leninist thought, including a lot of Lenin's, original writing, The State and Revolution and so on, David McClellan's selected writings of Karl Marx. And even at one point, there was a League of Communist Republicans established, and they had their own newsletter. We might talk about that. So there was a strong emphasis on political education. Wing communes emerged. So there were orderlies assigned to these wings, to every wing. That role was collectivized, and the wages were put into a pot, and the prisoners drew up a list of what they needed. And if there was a deficit, everybody contributed from their own resources to make sure that what was required was bought. So stamps, confectionery, that kind of stuff. As one of the prisoners I spoke to when I was doing the book put it to me, that outside prison, the quartermaster looked after arms and explosives, and inside prison he looked after tea bags and biscuits and stamps and such like. The charter that the IRA men devised differed from the code that the prisoners devised in Ethiopia, because it was independent of the prison administration, whereas the Ethiopian prisoners made sure that what they were doing fitted in with what the state and the authorities wanted to do, harmonized with it. The IRA charter was created by a group that rejected the legitimacy of the state that held them, and in the early part of the Troubles went to some lengths to murder as many prison officers as was thought necessary to influence the nature of their confinement. They got to a point in the 1990s where the segregation unit was closed. So imagine a maximum, the most secure prison in Europe without a punishment block, and where they allocated prisoners who wanted to speak the Irish language to a wing that they called, so that says Fáilte go Gaeltach na Fhisóga. So a Fhisóg is a lark, it's the Irish word for a lark, and that was Bobby Sands' pen name. So he wrote us on Fhisóg. So the name of this Gaeltach, this Irish-speaking part of the prison, is a kind of homage to Bobby Sands. And the prisoners had so much control over their daily lives by this point that they could allocate their own individuals to the parts of the prison where they wanted them to live. So this is my case study of an institution that was highly integrated and highly regulated too. And what about a place that was low in both? So low in integration and low in regulation. And I chose the Eastern Unit in Texas as a good example of this kind of institution. And the state of Texas didn't want to spend any money on prisons and felt, if anything, they should be turning a profit through, field labor. And this meant that the staffing was low. And a defining characteristic of Texas prisons, and the period I'm looking at here is the 1970s in particular, was the cultivation of a hand-picked cohort of prisoners, usually very violent men, to provide intelligence to the staff, who were few enough in number, and to enforce discipline. And they further divided a prisoner body that was already pretty divided on the basis of, place of origin, ethnicity, language, and so on. So to add to that, there was a body of prisoners appointed by the staff to enforce discipline, who received certain privileges in return. So they fraternized with the correctional staff. They informed on their fellows. They were a barrier between the staff and the prisoners, rather than siding with the prisoners against the staff. And to ease their own conditions, they were prepared to pass on information, even if that was to the detriment of their peers, or to enforce a discipline in a very violent way. And the Eastern Unit is interesting because it was the location for a legal challenge taken by a man called David Ruiz, who died in 2005. The other three prisoners I'm interested in are still alive. He died in 2005. And he was in and out of prison. He committed some acts of great violence against other prisoners and against himself, indeed. He was inspired by the civil rights and anti-war movements. And he announced that he wouldn't work in the fields like a slave anymore. So the Eastern Unit is a former slave plantation of 13,000 acres. The prisoners are out picking cotton for no pay. And I was kind of amused when I asked the prison staff over there, because prisoners in some countries get paid, not often, very much, but they do get some compensation for their efforts. And he thought that was an extraordinary idea, that any prisoner might get paid for working 10 or 12 hours a day, doing backbreaking work in a field, in, conditions of great heat and so on. Anyway, Ruiz decided he wasn't going to be treated like a slave anymore. And when the building tender threatened to, to use violence against him to get him back to work in the field, he cut his Achilles tendon. So this was a commonly done thing. It's called heel stringing. And you can imagine how painful that is. So how painful was the field labor if this was the way to avoid it. Anyway, Ruiz severed his Achilles tendon. He was unfit for work, and he became quite an accomplished writ writer. And he was responsible for litigation that eventually took, many years, led the courts to determine that incarceration by the Texas Department of Corrections constituted cruel and unusual punishment. So the official statement of purpose of the Texas Department of Corrections, so the law was that an inmate may not act in a supervisory or administrative capacity, and certainly may not administer disciplinary action over another inmate. That was breached every day by the building tender system. And the litigation that Ruiz initiated made this very clear, and the courts determined that the situation in Texas prisons was unconstitutional, and the building tender system was overthrown. There was huge recruitment of staff, a very turbulent, violent period for a couple of years, and so on. So the stated purpose had been repeatedly violated, and the courts determined that it had to change. The final institution that I want to mention to you, and then identify a couple of themes that have come out of the book, and then we have time for Q&A, is the Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. And the stated purpose there, is the prisoners have the right to expect that as a human being they'll be treated respectfully, impartially, and fairly by all personnel. And my point, of course, is that because it's an institution based on solitary confinement, it's inherently disrespectful and disintegrative of community and of individual personality too. And this is an example of a prison with a very high level of regulation and a vanishingly low level of integration, because if people are held apart all the time, how can they form the kinds of bonds that are necessary. And I mentioned at the beginning, there's some very good investigative journalism into this institution. And there's a really great article in The Nation last March by Aviva Stahl. And she's managed to get some footage, and it's published online with the article, of a prisoner in ADX Florence. So I mentioned I asked, could I visit? And they said no. And the UN rapporteur on torture has asked if they won't let anybody in. But she managed to get through a variety of through the courts and FOI requests and so on and so forth, some video footage of a prisoner there who's been force-fed hundreds and hundreds of times. So some of the prisoners, I think what started some of the hunger strikes was their prisoners had requested a copy of Barack Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope, and it wasn't, censored. They weren't allowed to have it. And there are very tight controls put on some of the Muslim prisoners there who, as well as being held in solitary confinement, their communications with the outside world are very, very tightly regulated. And this prisoner, Mohammed Salama, has been force-fed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And Aviva Stahl in her article quotes from him, and he translated a line from an Arabic poem which says, "Make me drink the bitter cup, but with dignity." It's profound, isn't it? And they wouldn't even allow him the dignity of refusing food. And they've been force-feeding him. His release date is 2067, of course. It's one of these preposterously long sentences. So if you had a bit of time and you had a look at that article, you'll see the footage of him being, manacled and, strapped to a chair and force-fed repeatedly against his wishes. So it's a rare insight into a very dark site. It's the place where prisoners within the Federal Bureau of Prisons are exiled. It's the highest security prison in the United States, and it's supposed to be for people who are very violent, predatory, or escape-prone, who can't be contained by a maximum security prison. You'll often see prisoners who, the shorthand, offensive kind of shorthand, the worst of the worst, being used to describe the men who were there, the raw men. It seemed to be the end of the road, and a warden who worked there described it as a clean version of hell. So it's severe. The men in the general population there get 10 hours out of their cell per week for exercise. They get an hour indoors. It alternates between indoors and outdoors. I've got photographs of the inside and the outside. I haven't put them on this presentation. The exercise in the indoors is in a windowless cell with a single chin-up bar, and euphemistically that's called the gym. So it's a bare room with a chin-up bar in it. If they go outside, it's in the recreation yard, accurately described as a dog run, a tiny cage that they go into, sometimes on their own, sometimes there are other cages in the same yard. They can get up to 5 visits a month, but I looked at the distances. There's a bit of litigation here that I'm going to mention in a moment, and I looked at the lead litigants and the distance from their home to this prison, and in some of them it was 1,800 miles, and I think the closest was 600 or 700 miles. So this place is remote. It's called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. And even if they have a family that have the wherewithal to make the visit and the time to get there, the visit takes place behind a kind of a plexiglass barrier. And before they go to the visit, they're strip searched, they're put in handcuffs, they're put in leg irons, there's a belly chain, a kind of a lead, they're brought to the visiting room. And after the visit, where there's been no contact, that takes place in reverse, and they're brought back and stripped and searched and so on. So there's a very disproportionately high level of kind of chained immobilization and unnecessary searching. And compare that with the visiting regime, even in the H blocks in Northern Ireland, where the most dangerous terrorists in Europe were, after they'd served 10 or 12 years, allowed home at Christmas for 5 days and given 2 weeks during the summer so they could go home and nurture community ties. And they always came back on time. As soon as they got back, of course, they started trying to dig tunnels and get out over the wall and all the rest of it. It's just mind-boggling to think that anything like that could be applied in the Supermax prison that I'm talking about. And one way of kind of imagining what life might be there is to think about the average car parking space in the US. I'm not talking about a space for a Winnebago or a massive recreational vehicle, I'm just talking about the standard car parking space outside a shop or a cinema, what have you. Measures 9 by 18 feet. That's 162 square feet. The living area in a cell in the ADX Florence is 87 square feet. So the penal hawks in the US might bear this in mind next time they pull in outside the store for a bag of groceries or something like this. This is really tight living. The prisoners there took to the courts. So the period of time I'm interested in here is from about 2001 to 2011. And one of the lead litigants, the litigation is called Cunningham. And one of the lead litigants was a man called John J. Powers. And he was convicted of bank robbery in 1990, and he got a 40-year sentence. And during his sentence, one of his friends was being attacked, and he went to his assistance. He brought him to the infirmary in the prison, and the friend died. And the attackers were members of a white supremacist gang, the Aryan Brotherhood. And Jack Powers testified against them. So he put his own life in danger as a result. And he was told that he would get a reduction in his sentence for his assistance. And the reduction didn't happen. And he was scared. He felt he was very vulnerable in prison. So he escaped from the federal prison he was in, and he was picked up a couple of days later and brought back. And because he'd escaped from a federal prison, he was sent to the ADX in Florence. And he spent 10 years there. So he was sent to the control unit there, and he spent 10 years there. As soon as he got there, of course, the Aryan Brotherhood prisoners started threatening him and so on. Even though he was in solitary confinement, they let it be known that he was a target. And he committed savage violence on his body. And it's all set out in the litigation. He's a brilliant guy, and he's written some fantastic accounts of his life there. And the New York Times did, they do these little video documentaries. They did one of him returning and going back to his mother after his release from prison a couple of years ago. He, like David Ruiz, he cut his Achilles tendon. He bit off one of his fingers. He removed a testicle. He covered his body with these tattoos one night with carbon paper and some broken glass. Before he went to the ADX, he had no history of mental illness. So he was suffering from post-traumatic stress as a result of his friend being murdered. And then the isolation that he was put into in Florence just caused him to deteriorate very dramatically. This is a prison that's run without the consent of the prisoners. And the lines of control are unambiguous, and relationships between prisoners are non-existent. So it's a very brutally simple set of human relations that requires a high degree of enforcement of regulations that govern every aspect of daily existence, and the separation of prisoners to such a degree that they can't form any meaningless bonds. A few conclusions, and then we can have a chat. I suppose the book has three main aims. One is to twist the penal kaleidoscope a little bit, to cause readers to question the assertion by Sykes that custodial institutions share basic similarities which override the variations of time, place, and purpose that I put up on one of my first slides. I think if Sykes had worked in the Eastern Unit or a prison in a southern state, power relations would have looked very different. There would have been different prohibitions and norms, and maybe different pains of confinement. And claims of universality maybe would have been more muted. And if you'd taken a comparative approach, who knows how the society of captives might have been theorized. So it's just to say maybe it's time to rethink Sykes a little bit. And second, I hope that the approach that I articulate offers a template that might allow us to generate novel perspectives on environments that have lost their capacity to inspire because we've looked at them in the same way for so long, as well as opening up routes into new areas of inquiry. And I'd be pleased if what I put together would offer a new way of thinking about the organization of prison life that can be explored with profit in other contexts. And I set out in the book a kind of a three-step approach to doing this. And the first step is to plot the coordinates of an institution in terms of the dimensions of integration and regulation that I've described. And the second step is to add a bit of texture by thinking in terms of illegitimacy, and compliance. And the third step then is to work through a number of subsidiary factors that I discuss in the book. So after thinking about where does this institution fit in terms of the dimensions of integration and regulation, and then thinking a bit about legitimacy and whether what's the basis of compliance, is it normative or coercive or what have you, then to think about how porous the institution is, the level of security and autonomy that the prisoners have, the spatial dimension of their confinement, their ability to move around the institution during the day, the status of the prisoner in their own view and in the view of the authorities. So the prisoners in the H blocks saw themselves as prisoners of war, the authorities saw them as terrorists, etc. The nature of relations with staff. So are they non-existent? Are they brutal? Are they cordial? And so on. Then to think about, whether there's some constitution, and if it's written, what are its key characteristics? And then to make some assessment of the threats to bodily integrity and the threats to the individual's psyche while they're in confinement. So I kind of set out in the book a three-step approach to understanding the social life of a prison that I think might be applicable regardless of, geography. And then the final observation is that I hope I've got in the book, I do a little pen portrait of each of the prisoners whose experience I use as a kind of a lens to view the institution through. And I hope that they're of interest, because I think where people find meaning and how they make sense of their experiences are at the heart of the human endeavour. And that individuals can mould their environments just as they're moulded by them. Now, I'm not exaggerating to what extent they can do it if they're in the ADX Florence is a pretty totalising place, but the prisoners there instigated litigation that led to some softening of their treatment, especially those among them who suffered from mental illness. So I think it's important to keep the individual experience to the front. And just to conclude, my final sentence today is the final sentence that's in the book, which is, after all, punishment is about pain, and pain is personal. So that's all I have to say. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ian, for this very interesting presentation.